My daughter-in-law screamed at me right in front of 30 people at the Christmas party. "Mom, get up! This is our home now, and you no longer belong here. Remember, you're only a guest." She had clearly forgotten who the real owner of this house was. I quietly walked out of the room and did something that made her pay the price. I'm truly grateful for your presence on Silent Revenge with Auntie May. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Please note, creative elements are added for storytelling and learning. Any resemblance to actual names or locations is strictly coincidental, but the core takeaway is meant to empower you. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house after someone dies. Not the quiet of an empty room or a switched-off television. It is heavier than that. It has weight and texture, and if you have lived inside it long enough, you learn to stop fighting it and simply carry it with you from room to room, like an extra layer of clothing you cannot take off. My name is Evangeline Marsh. I am 68 years old. I live in a house on Clover Hill Road in Dayton, Ohio, on 10 acres of land that my husband Theodore and I spent the better part of our lives turning from a muddy stretch of nothing into the only place I have ever truly called home. Theodore has been gone for 18 months now, a heart attack on a Thursday morning in June while he was standing in the backyard checking on his rose bushes. Our neighbor Carol found him when she came over to return a casserole dish. He was 69 years old and had never spent a single night in a hospital in his life. And then one ordinary Thursday, he was simply gone, the way a candle goes out. No warning, no gradual dimming, just light and then darkness. I do not say this to make you feel sorry for me. I say it because you need to understand what this house meant before I tell you what happened to it. Theodore built this place with his hands. Not metaphorically, I mean he drove the nails himself, laid the kitchen tile himself, sanded and stained every inch of the hardwood floors in the living room on his knees over 3 consecutive weekends in the summer of 1994, while I brought him iced tea and pretended not to notice when he cursed at the belt sander. He built the bookshelves in the hallway without a single instruction sheet, measuring twice and cutting once the way his own father had taught him. He planted the rose garden along the back fence the spring after our youngest moved out 12 bushes in 4 different colors, because he said the yard looked too empty and he wanted me to have something beautiful to look at from the kitchen window every morning. I looked at those roses every morning for 11 years. I look at them still. The house has 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch. Theodore repainted every other summer without being asked, and a study where he kept his woodworking books and his coin collection and the gold watch I gave him on our 25th wedding anniversary, a Hamilton khaki field, the kind he had admired in a magazine and never once considered buying for himself, because he was not a man who bought himself things he admired in magazines. I had it engraved on the back to Teddy, "Every minute with you counts, Evie." He wore it every day for the last 20 years of his life. I never once saw his wrist without it. After Theodore died, I learned what it meant to live inside a house that was built for 2 people and now held only 1. I learned to cook smaller portions and stop setting 2 coffee cups out of habit. I learned to sleep on my side of the bed without instinctively reaching across to the other side in the first hollow minutes of morning. I learned that grief is not one long wave that crashes over you and recedes. It is 1,000 small waves, unexpected ones that knock you sideways in the cereal aisle at Kroger when you reach for the brand he liked, and then remember you do not need it anymore. I was managing. That is the honest word for it. Not thriving, not healed, but managing the way a house manages through a hard winter, with the furnace running and the pipes intact and the structure sound, even when everything outside is frozen solid. And then 6 months after I buried my husband, my phone rang at 8:15 on a Wednesday morning. I was standing at the kitchen sink with both hands wrapped around my coffee mug, watching a cardinal on the bird feeder Theodore had mounted to the back fence post the summer before he died. The name on the screen was Marcus, my son, my only child, 41 years old, living in Columbus with his wife Nicole, running a business consulting firm he had launched 4 years earlier with money I had loaned him without a contract, because he was my son, and I trusted him the way you trust the people you raised from nothing. I answered on the second ring. His voice cracked the moment he spoke. Not the crack of a man who had been crying, the crack of a man who had been holding something back for a very long time and had finally run out of the strength to keep holding it. "Mom," he said, "I'm in trouble. The firm is gone. We lost everything. Nicole and I, we can't make rent. We don't know what to do." I stood at that kitchen sink for a long moment, looking at Theodore's bird feeder, listening to my son breathe on the other end of the line. I thought about what Theodore would have said. I thought about the way he used to put his hand on Marcus's shoulder when Marcus was small and frightened, and how that one gesture always seemed to be enough. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. "Come home," I said. "Both of you. Come home." I hung up the phone and looked around the kitchen, the tile Theodore had laid the shelves. He had built the window above the sink that framed the rose garden like a painting. And I thought that this house had been built to hold a family, and a family was coming back to fill it. I did not know, standing there in the quiet of that Thursday morning, that I had just opened the front door and invited in the worst mistake of my life. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon in late June, pulling into the driveway in a rented moving truck that was only half full, which told me more about how far things had fallen than anything Marcus had said on the phone. When you pack your entire life into a truck and the truck is only half full, it means the other half is already gone. Marcus climbed out first. He had lost weight since Christmas, not a little. A noticeable amount, the kind that changes the shape of a man's face and makes him look older than his years. He stood at the end of the driveway with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked up at the house, the way a person looks at something they are ashamed to need. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved to the rose bushes along the back fence and stayed there the way eyes do when they are looking for something to land on that is not another person's face. I walked down the porch steps and put my arms around him without saying a word. He held on longer than I expected. His shoulders shook once, just once, and then he pulled back and cleared his throat and looked away toward the truck. Nicole came around from the passenger side. She was 37, dark-haired, dressed in a cream-colored blouse that had not wrinkled during the drive, which struck me as the kind of detail a person only manages when they are paying careful attention to appearances. She carried a canvas tote bag on one shoulder and a small potted orchid in both hands, which she held out to me the moment she reached the porch steps. "For you," she said, and her smile was warm and immediate, the kind that reaches the eyes. "Marcus told me you love flowers. I thought this might brighten up the kitchen windowsill." I thanked her and held the orchid and told her it was beautiful, because it was. I told them both to come inside, that I had made lemonade and there was cold chicken in the refrigerator. And Nicole said, "Oh, Mom, you didn't have to do all that," in a way that sounded genuine, and for a moment, standing on the porch of the house Theodore built with my son home and the smell of cut grass in the air, I felt something close to relief. I gave them the larger guest room at the end of the hall, the one with the south-facing window that caught the afternoon light. Theodore had always called it the good room. I put fresh towels on the bed and moved the extra boxes I had stored there since the funeral into the basement, and I did not mention that moving those boxes took me 2 trips in 40 minutes and left my lower back aching for the rest of the day, because that was not information anyone needed. The first weeks were easier than I had expected. Nicole cooked dinner 3 nights running without being asked good meals, with actual effort behind them. A roast chicken with rosemary, a pasta dish from scratch, a soup she said was her grandmother's recipe. She asked me where I kept things in the kitchen and actually waited for the answer instead of moving them on her own. She sat with me on the porch after dinner and asked about Theodore, what he had been like, how we had met, what he did with his hands when he was thinking through a problem. He rubbed the back of his neck. I told her one evening. Every single time. Didn't matter if he was figuring out a plumbing issue or deciding which route to take on a road trip. Same gesture every time. Nicole smiled at that. "Marcus does the same thing," she said. I always wondered where he got it. I looked at her in the fading light and thought that maybe I had been wrong to feel uncertain. Maybe this was simply what it looked like when a family came back together after a hard season. Maybe the house that Theodore had built for 2 people still had enough room in it for 4. Marcus seemed steadier with each passing week. He started shaving regularly again. He helped me carry the groceries in from the car without being asked. One Sunday morning, he appeared in the kitchen with his sleeves rolled up and fixed the slow drain in the bathroom sink that I had been meaning to call a plumber about for 3 months. And when I thanked him, he shrugged the way Theodore used to shrug one shoulder quick, as if gratitude made him slightly uncomfortable. I watched my son that morning and felt a loosening in my chest that I had not felt since the funeral. I thought he is going to be all right. I thought we are going to be all right. I did not notice then that while I was watching Marcus fix the drain, Nicole was standing in the doorway of Theodore's study with her arms crossed, looking slowly around the room with an expression I would not understand until much later. Not curiosity, not admiration. Something quieter and more calculating than either of those things, the expression of a person who is not seeing what is there, but is already imagining what could replace it. I did not notice. I was too busy feeling grateful. 3 months passed. The roses along the back fence bloomed a second time the way they sometimes did in a warm Ohio autumn, and I cut a few and put them in a vase on the kitchen table the way Theodore had always liked. Nicole came downstairs that morning, poured herself a coffee, and sat across from me at the table. She reached over and touched one of the roses gently, then looked up at me with an expression I had never seen from her before, something between sympathy and decision. "Mom," she said, "you've been doing so much around this house on your own. Let me start handling the bills, the utilities, the insurance, all of it. You shouldn't have to carry that by yourself." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her fingers were warm. Her voice was soft. "That's what family is for," she said. I looked at her hand over mine. I looked at the roses Theodore had planted, so I would have something beautiful to look at every morning, and I said yes. My mother used to say that the most dangerous person in your home is the one who makes you feel grateful for being allowed to stay. I did not understand what she meant when she said it. I was young, and I thought she was being cynical about something that did not apply to me the way young people always think that hard-won wisdom does not apply to them until the morning it does. I understand now. The shift happened slowly enough that I kept finding reasons to explain it away. Nicole began managing the utility bills the week after I agreed to let her help, and for the first few days I told myself it was a relief. Then she took over the homeowner's insurance renewal without asking, and I told myself she was being efficient. Then she began placing the weekly grocery orders online without consulting me, and items I had bought every week for 30 years, the particular brand of coffee Theodore had introduced me to in 1981, the specific oatmeal I ate every morning, the hand soap my mother had used, and that still smelled faintly like the home I had grown up in stopped appearing, replaced by whatever Nicole preferred. I told myself that this was what younger people did. They handled things digitally. They had systems. They moved faster than I did, and there was no shame in that. I was very good at telling myself things. Then she rearranged the kitchen. Not all at once, that was what made it so difficult to name as what it was. First it was the cabinet above the stove, which she said was inefficient and needed reorganizing. I came down one morning to find my largest mixing bowl, the one I had used to make every birthday cake Marcus had ever had, relocated to the top shelf above my reach without the step stool. I used the step stool and did not mention it. Then it was the spice rack Theodore had mounted to the wall beside the refrigerator himself, drilling the holes on a Saturday afternoon, while I read the newspaper at the kitchen table and handed him the level when he asked for it. Nicole replaced it with a magnetic strip she ordered online, and Theodore's careful Saturday afternoon work came down in 4 minutes with a screwdriver. I watched her do it from the doorway and found I could not make myself speak. Then it was the drawer. The third drawer on the left side of the kitchen island, the one I had used for 31 years to keep the things that mattered in a low-level but continuous way. Utility account numbers written in my own hand, the phone number for my doctor that I had memorized, but still liked to see written down the small notepad where I tracked the garden's watering schedule. And at the very back they're still folded, the way I had folded it the week after the funeral, the list of Theodore's medications that I had never quite gotten around to throwing away, because throwing it away felt like a decision I was not ready to make. One morning, the drawer was empty, not reorganized, empty. Nicole had transferred everything into a folder she placed in the filing cabinet in Marcus's new home office, and she had not told me where she had put it until I asked. And when I asked, she said, "It's all filed properly now, Mom. You'll be able to find everything much more easily," in the patient, slightly elevated tone of someone explaining a self-evident improvement to a person who should be grateful for it. "I'm just trying to make things easier for you," she said each time. Always the same words, always the same tone, the tone you use with someone who needs to be managed rather than spoken to. I heard it more and more clearly as the weeks passed, the particular frequency of it, the way it sat just below the threshold of rudeness, so that objecting to it would have made me seem unreasonable. Marcus was gone more often than he was home. He had started talking about a new business venture, meetings with potential investors, calls he needed to take in the car with the windows up. When I asked how things were progressing, he rubbed the back of his neck and said slowly and changed the subject. I did not push. I had learned raising him that Marcus processed difficulty by going quiet and retreating into motion, and I told myself that was all. This was a man working through a hard season the way he always had, and the best thing I could do was give him room. I was, as I have said, very good at telling myself things. One afternoon in early October, I drove to the farmer's market on 5th Street and came home with yellow tulips. Theodore had always loved yellow tulips. He said they looked like small suns, and he said it every single time I brought them home with the same mild delight he brought to things he genuinely liked, regardless of how many times he had encountered them, which was one of the qualities I had loved most in him and missed most acutely now. I was in a better mood than I had been in weeks. I came through the front door with the tulips wrapped in brown paper under my arm, set them on the kitchen counter, and walked down the hallway toward my bedroom to change my shoes before arranging them in a vase. I pushed open the door and stopped. The room was wrong. That was the only thought my mind produced for several seconds, not a complete sentence, not an accusation, just the flat recognition of a fact: the room is wrong. The bedside table where I had kept Theodore's photograph since the week after the funeral was bare. The closet door stood open, and the hangers inside held clothes I did not recognize: Marcus's suits, a row of Nicole's blouses in ascending shades of gray. A pair of men's dress shoes sat on the floor beside the bed. Nicole's perfume hung in the air, sweet and foreign, and entirely certain of its right to be there. My chest tightened so sharply, I pressed one hand flat against the doorframe to steady myself. My other hand was still holding the tulips. My clothes were gone. My jewelry box was gone. The small framed photograph of Theodore and me on our wedding day, the one I reached for every single morning before I got out of bed, the one I had touched so many times in the past 18 months that the glass over it had taken on the particular quality of something handled with great regularity and great care, was gone. I walked to the closet and opened it fully and stood there looking at Marcus's dress shirts hanging in a row where my dresses had been 12 hours earlier, and I felt something move through me that started as shock and landed somewhere closer to a grief I did not yet have the right word for. My hands were shaking by the time Nicole appeared in the doorway behind me. She was carrying a cup of coffee, and she did not look alarmed. "Oh, good, you're back," she said in the brisk voice of someone who had been expecting a minor inconvenience and had come prepared to resolve it efficiently. "We moved your things downstairs this morning. The corner room, it's quieter down there, closer to the bathroom. It makes much more sense at your age." I turned around and looked at her. I was still holding the tulips. My voice, when it came, was quieter than I intended, which sometimes happens when what you feel is too large for the volume you expected to use. "This is my room, Nicole." She tilted her head slightly, the particular tilt of a person deciding how much patience to extend to an unreasonable position. "Mom, the room is bigger, and Marcus really needs the space for when he has early calls. You'll be much more comfortable downstairs. It's honestly not a big deal." Theodore and I shared this room for 31 years. Something moved across her face, not guilt, not softness. Something closer to mild irritation at an obstacle she had already decided was not worth taking seriously. She exhaled short, deliberate, the kind of sigh that is not an accident, and said, "You really think at your age you need a room this size?" She walked back down the hallway before I could answer. Her footsteps were unhurried. She took her coffee with her. She was not angry, and she was not precisely unkind. She simply spoke to me the way a person speaks to furniture they are rearranging, without hostility and without any particular interest in the furniture's opinion on the matter. I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom for a long time after she left. The tulips were still in my hand. I looked at them, yellow, already starting to open in the warmth of the house, the way Theodore had always liked to see them. I set them down on the bare surface of the bedside table that had held his photograph for 18 months. I thought about my mother's words, and for the first time since Marcus had come home, I stopped explaining things away. I've spent a great deal of my life paying attention to small things. Theodore used to say I noticed everything and forgave too much, and he meant it as a compliment, though I am no longer certain it deserved to be one. After the bedroom, I started keeping a list. Not on paper. I did not want Nicole finding it the way she had found her way into every other corner of this house. I kept it in my head the way I used to memorize grocery lists before the age of smartphones, item by item, returning to it each night in the small downstairs room where I now slept, and going over every entry with the same careful attention Theodore used to give his woodworking measurements. Twice, he always said, measure twice, cut once. He had said it to Marcus when Marcus was 12 and building his first birdhouse from a kit, and he had said it to me the summer we refinished the kitchen cabinets together. Said it in the particular way of a man who believed that patience applied before action saved you from a great deal of regret applied after it. I was measuring, and I was not going to regret being thorough. The photograph went first. It had hung in the same spot on the living room wall for 30 years, our wedding portrait, Theodore in his dark suit, with the boutonniere I had chosen from the florist on 5th Street, me in my mother's altered dress, with the lace sleeves. She had stayed up 2 nights to finish, both of us squinting slightly into the October sun outside St. Michael's Church on Brown Street. It was not a glamorous photograph. We were not a glamorous couple. But every time I walked past it, I saw the 2 people we had been on that particular October Saturday, young and hopeful and slightly afraid and entirely certain of each other, and it made the hallway feel inhabited in a way that mattered to me deeply. I walked past that wall one morning in mid-October and stopped so suddenly I nearly lost my balance. The portrait was gone. In its place hung a large canvas print of an abstract painting, all gray and copper angles, the kind sold in sets of 3 at home decor stores, the kind designed to go with everything and therefore going with nothing, the kind that looks like a room decorator's suggestion of personality rather than the evidence of one. My chest did something that was not quite pain and not quite nausea, but occupied the same general territory. I found our wedding portrait 2 days later, face down in a cardboard box in the basement, wrapped loosely in a dish towel that had already been used. I stood there with the box open in front of me and looked at the back of that frame without moving for a long time. Then I carried it upstairs with both hands and said nothing to anyone. I put it in my room, the small downstairs room that had been a guest room and was now mine, and set it on the nightstand beside the smaller photograph of Theodore that I had moved there when Nicole cleared out our bedroom. I looked at both photographs side by side and thought that a person could read everything they needed to know about what was happening in this house simply by noting where those 2 photographs were now and where they had been 6 months ago. The furniture came next. Theodore's armchair had been in the living room since 1993. A wide, solid thing in dark green fabric, not fashionable, never fashionable, but built to last and fitted to the particular geography of Theodore's back in a way he maintained was irreplaceable. He had reupholstered it himself twice the second time at 62, kneeling on the living room floor with a staple gun and a roll of batting and a determination I found both admirable and faintly ridiculous. He said there was no reason to replace something that still worked. He had said the same thing about the truck he drove for 11 years and about our marriage during our worst year, and he had been right every time. I came home from my doctor's appointment on a Thursday afternoon in late October, and the armchair was gone. A sleek gray sectional sofa sat in its place, still carrying the faint chemical smell of new upholstery, positioned at an angle that made the room look larger, and felt to me like a room in a hotel, clean and arranged and completely without memory. "Storage," Nicole said when I asked. "It was taking up too much space. The new sofa opens up the whole room." She gestured at the living room with the expansive confidence of someone unveiling an improvement. When I did not respond, she added in the tone she reserved for my unnecessary resistance to progress, "You can barely tell the difference." I could tell every difference. The dent in the carpet where the armchair's front left leg had sat for 30 years was still there. A small rectangular impression the gray sectional did not cover. The lamp Theodore had always positioned to throw light correctly over his shoulder when he read was now in the wrong place entirely. The room had Theodore in every corner of it, and then it did not. And what it had, instead, was nothing clean, arranged nicely, lit nothing. I said none of this. I went to my room and looked at the wedding portrait on the nightstand. Then one Tuesday morning, I walked into Theodore's study to water the small fern on the windowsill, and I understood that Nicole had moved well beyond rearranging. The study was Theodore's room in the truest sense, his woodworking books lined up by subject on shelves he had built himself. His coin collection in the flat display case he had constructed from cherry wood over one winter, working in the garage on weekend mornings with a patience I had always found beautiful in him. And in the top drawer of his desk, the Hamilton khaki field watch I had given him on our 25th anniversary, engraved on the case back to Teddy. "Every minute with you counts, Evie." I had not been able to wear it. I had not been able to display it, but I had opened that drawer every few weeks since the funeral, just to see it lying there face up, just to read those words and feel they were still true, even though the man they had been written for was not. I walked to the desk and opened the drawer. It was empty. I opened it again the way you press a bruise a second time to confirm what it is. Still empty. I looked at the display case on the shelf. The coin collection, 30 years of careful accumulation, silver dollars and wheat pennies, and the 1909 SVDB Lincoln cent. Theodore had driven to Cincinnati to buy at auction for $400 and spoken about with barely contained pride for the better part of a decade was gone. The cherry wood case sat with its velvet inserts bare the brass label still reading T.R. Marsh Collection in letters Theodore had engraved himself. I set the watering can down on the desk. Nicole was in the kitchen making coffee when I walked in, her back to me, the carafe in her hand. "The watch," I said. "Theodore's gold watch, and the coins. Where are they?" She did not turn around immediately. She poured her coffee, set the carafe down with a small, precise click, then looked at me over her shoulder with an expression of mild, practiced patience, the expression of a woman who had anticipated this conversation and already decided how it would end. "I sold a few things," she said. "Old stuff just sitting there. You weren't using them, Mom. There's no point holding on to things that only collect dust." The watering can was still in my hand. My grip tightened until the plastic handle cut into my palm and my knuckles ached white. "That watch was a gift," I said. "I gave it to him on our anniversary. It had his name engraved on it. It had my name engraved on it." Nicole turned to face me fully. She leaned against the counter with her mug cradled in both hands and looked at me with an expression I had never seen directed at me in 68 years, of living the expression of someone who has already decided your feelings are an inconvenience they have budgeted time for and do not intend to accommodate beyond that budget. "Mom," she said gently and with a terrible finality, "Theodore is gone. Holding on to every single thing he ever touched is not healthy. I am trying to help you move forward." She took her coffee and walked out. Her footsteps went down the hall and up the stairs, and I heard the bedroom door, my bedroom door, close behind her with a soft, definitive click. I stood at the counter in the house Theodore built in the kitchen, where he had drunk his coffee every morning for 31 years, and I felt something settle into my chest that was not grief and was not anger, but was harder and quieter and more useful than either the cold, absolute certainty of a woman who has finally run out of reasons to doubt what she is seeing. I went back to my list, and I started adding names. Theodore used to say that a house will always tell you the truth if you are willing to listen to it. Loose floorboards, drafty windows, pipes that knock in the walls at 2 in the morning. The house is always talking, he said. Most people are just too busy or too comfortable to hear it. I had started listening. It began with the mail. After the bedroom, after the watch, after the coin collection, I began paying closer attention to the small rhythms of the day, the things that had always been mine and were quietly, steadily being moved out of my reach. The mailbox at the end of the driveway was one of them. I had collected my own mail every weekday morning for 31 years, rain or frost, or the kind of flat, gray Ohio cold that settles in by November and does not lift until April. It had never once occurred to me that this was something anyone would interfere with. Then I noticed that Marcus was getting there first. Not every day, not in an obvious pattern that would have made me suspicious immediately. 3 times in 1 week, then twice the next, always casual, always, with a reasonable explanation ready. He was already outside. He had gone out to check the recycling bin. He had seen the truck from the window. And the mail he brought in was always thin grocery circulars, a credit card offer the quarterly newsletter from St. Michael's that I had been receiving for 20 years. On the 4th morning, I woke up 40 minutes earlier than usual and was standing at the kitchen window with my coffee when the mail truck rounded the bend on Clover Hill Road. I set my mug down, walked to the front door, and had the mailbox open before Marcus appeared on the porch behind me in his robe. "Oh," he said, "I was just going to grab that." "I have it," I said. I carried the stack inside. Most of it was exactly what I had come to expect, thin, unremarkable, the papery equivalent of nothing. But near the bottom of the stack was an envelope I did not recognize. White business-sized, no advertising on the outside. The return address read Dayton First National Bank. My name was on the front, not Marcus, not Nicole, Evangeline R. Marsh. I tucked it under my arm without opening it in front of Marcus and carried the rest of the mail to the kitchen counter. I waited until I heard him go back upstairs before I sat down at the table and opened it. It was a preliminary notification. Formal language bank letterhead, the kind of letter designed to sound routine and unthreatening. It informed me that a home equity line of credit application had been received under my name using my Social Security number for a loan secured against the property at 4419 Clover Hill Road, Dayton, Ohio, my home paid off in full 19 years ago in the amount of $380,000. I had not submitted any application. I had not spoken to anyone at Dayton First National about any loan. I had not signed a single piece of paper. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along its original crease and placed it in the inside pocket of my cardigan against my ribs and sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the house around me. That afternoon, while Marcus left for what he called a meeting downtown and Nicole drove to the salon, I went to Marcus's home office. I had not been inside since he had taken it over in July. And standing in the doorway, I felt the particular discomfort of a person entering a room in their own home where they no longer feel entitled to be. I pushed past it. The desk drawers were not locked. The first 2 held nothing of interest. Phone chargers, a legal pad with doodles on it, a broken pen. The 3rd drawer, the deep one at the bottom right, was heavier than it should have been. Inside, I found a manila folder thick with papers. A collection notice from a private lending firm in Columbus dated September, demanding payment of $140,000 within 30 days. Beneath it, a second notice from a different creditor, another $60,000. Then a personal loan agreement signed in Marcus's handwriting for an additional $140,000, borrowed at an interest rate that made my stomach drop. A total debt load by my rough count of over $340,000 accumulated across 18 months of a business that had been failing long before Marcus had called me in June. And at the very bottom of the folder, a single sheet of white paper that was not a form or a notice or a legal document. It was a handwritten list in Nicole's careful, even script. I recognized her handwriting from the grocery lists she left on the counter. The list read 1 power of attorney, 2 equity loan application, 3 competency evaluation, 4 transfer. I read those 4 lines standing at Marcus's desk in the afternoon quiet of my own house. Then I read them again. A power of attorney would give someone else legal authority to act on my behalf, to sign documents, manage accounts, make financial decisions in my name. A competency evaluation, if filed with a court in Ohio, could be used to support a petition arguing that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. Transfer meant exactly what it sounded like. They were not just planning to borrow against my house, they were planning to take it from me entirely, legally, quietly, while I made them dinner and thanked them for being here. I placed the list back in the folder. I placed the folder back in the drawer. I pushed the drawer closed with both hands and stood there until my breathing steadied. Then I walked to my bedroom, changed into my coat and shoes, and drove to an electronics store on Far Hills Avenue, 40 minutes from home, and paid cash. The devices were small enough to fit inside a closed fist. 2 of them matte black, no larger than a matchbook, with battery lives of up to 72 hours and audio sensitivity sufficient to pick up a conversation from across a room. The young man at the electronics store on Far Hills Avenue had explained all of this without asking why I needed them, which I appreciated. I paid cash, kept the receipt in my coat pocket, and drove home in the dark with both devices in my purse and the heat turned up high against the November cold. Ohio is a one-party consent state. That means a person may legally record any conversation in which they themselves are a participant without notifying the other parties. I had looked this up on my phone in the parking lot of the electronics store before I went inside, because Theodore had taught me never to act on something I had not first confirmed was true. I was a participant in every conversation that took place in my own home. Everything I recorded inside those walls was mine to keep. I placed the first device behind the row of cookbooks on the kitchen shelf, the ones Nicole had rearranged but not removed because they were useful to her. I placed the second one in the living room, tucked behind the base of the lamp on the side table near the window, the lamp that had been in that spot since 1997 and that Nicole had not yet gotten around to replacing. I did both in the space of 12 minutes on a Tuesday evening after Marcus and Nicole had gone upstairs, moving through my own house in the dark, the way you move through a place you know well enough not to need the lights. The first 3 days produced nothing useful. Ordinary conversation, grocery discussions, a phone call Nicole made to her sister in Indianapolis that was entirely unremarkable. I listened to each recording alone in my room each evening with the volume low earphones and going through the audio, the way Theodore used to go through his woodworking plans methodically, without rushing, unwilling to skip anything, in case the thing that mattered was buried in the middle of something that seemed like nothing. On the 4th day, I heard Nicole's voice from the kitchen, low and careful, the particular register a person uses when they want to be heard by the person they are speaking to and no one else. She was on the phone. I caught only her side of the conversation. "The document needs her signature before Christmas," she said. "That's the deadline we're working with. If it doesn't happen before the holidays, the whole timeline shifts, and we cannot afford that." A pause. "He's handling her. She trusts him. That's the advantage we have, and I don't want to waste it." Another pause longer. "Just have the paperwork ready. We'll get her to sign." I listened to that recording 4 times that evening, sitting on the edge of my bed in the small downstairs room with Theodore's photograph propped against the lamp on the nightstand. My jaw ached from holding it tight without realizing it. I set the earphones down, pressed both palms flat against my knees, and breathed slowly until the ache subsided. Then I pressed play again because I needed to be certain of every word. Day 7 produced the conversation I had been most afraid to find. Marcus and Nicole late at night, voices low in the living room. The audio was clear enough that I could hear the particular creak of the gray sectional sofa Nicole had put in Theodore's armchair's place. Marcus spoke first. "The competency evaluation has Harmon confirmed he'll sign off, Nicole. He confirmed last week. He said he can do it without an in-person exam. We give him the documentation we've prepared, and he files it as a formal assessment. I want to be precise about what Dr. Harmon was allegedly agreeing to do because it matters. In Ohio, a petition for guardianship, a legal process that can strip a person of the right to manage their own finances and property, requires a formal medical evaluation of the individual's mental capacity. Dr. Harmon, according to what I heard on that recording, had agreed to produce a signed psychiatric assessment declaring me mentally incompetent without ever examining me based entirely on documentation that Marcus and Nicole had prepared themselves. This is not a gray area under the law. It is healthcare fraud. It is perjury. And in Ohio, when committed against a person over the age of 60, it carries additional charges under the state's elder abuse statutes. I did not know all of that on the night I heard the recording. I learned it later from a man who had spent 30 years knowing exactly which laws applied to exactly this kind of situation. But I understood enough to feel the floor shift beneath me in a way that had nothing to do with the house settling. Marcus again, and if she contests it, Nicole without hesitation. She won't have the legal standing to contest it. That's the whole point of the POA. Once that's in place, her signature on anything else becomes irrelevant. Day 9 was the last day I needed. Nicole on the phone again in the voice she used when she was talking to someone she considered a professional equal. After Christmas, we moved the paperwork. The loan application is already in processing. Once the competency filing goes through, the transfer follows automatically. A brief pause. By spring, we list the house. 4419 Clover Hill is a 4-bedroom on 10 acres in a seller's market. We'll clear enough to settle everything and have money left over. She said the address of my home, the way a person says the address of a property they have already decided belongs to them. I turned off the recording. I sat in the dark for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and found the number I had not dialed in over 2 years. The number Theodore had kept written in his own handwriting on the inside cover of his address book, which I had kept in my nightstand drawer since the day he died. Gerald Potts, attorney at law. I pressed call. Gerald Potts drove out to Clover Hill Road the following morning. He did not ask me to come to his office. He showed up at 8:45 with a travel mug of coffee and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a leather portfolio under his arm that was worn soft at the corners from 30 years of use. And when I opened the front door, he looked at my face and said, "Tell me everything, Evie. Start at the beginning." I had known Gerald since 1989. He had handled Theodore's business affairs for over 2 decades, contracts, property filings, the trust documents we had drawn up together after Theodore's first health scare in 2012. He was 67 years old, barrel-chested, with the deliberate, unhurried manner of a man who had learned long ago that patience in a room produces better results than volume. Theodore had trusted him completely. That was the only credential I needed. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Nicole had covered my hand with hers 3 months ago, and called herself family. I laid everything out in front of Gerald, the bank notification, the photographs I had taken of the papers in Marcus's drawer, the handwritten list in Nicole's script, and the recordings. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When the last recording ended, he took his reading glasses off his forehead and set them on the table, and looked at me across the stack of evidence with an expression I had seen him use exactly once before in the hallway outside a courtroom in 2006, when a contractor had tried to defraud Theodore out of $40,000 on a property renovation. "Do you understand what they were planning to do to you?" he asked. "I do," I said. "That's why I called you." Gerald picked up his pen. His first call was to Sandra Reeves at Dayton First National Bank. Sandra had managed my accounts for 11 years, a precise, no-nonsense woman in her mid-40s who had once caught a billing error on my homeowner's insurance that saved me over $2,000 and considered it an unremarkable part of her job. Gerald explained the situation in 4 sentences. Sandra asked 2 questions. Then she said she would personally flag the equity loan application for fraud review and freeze all processing on the account immediately pending a formal investigation. Under the Bank Secrecy Act and federal mortgage fraud statutes, financial institutions are required to file a suspicious activity report with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network when evidence of identity-based loan fraud is detected. Sandra told us the report would be filed by end of business that day. Gerald's second call was to Ray Kowalski. Ray was a private investigator based in Dayton who specialized in elder financial abuse cases, the particular and growing category of fraud in which family members or caregivers exploit the trust of older adults to obtain control of their assets. Gerald had worked with Ray on 3 previous cases. He was methodical licensed and had a working relationship with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office that Gerald described simply as productive. Ray arrived at the house that afternoon while Marcus and Nicole were out. He was a compact, quiet man in his early 50s with the kind of face that did not draw attention to itself, which Gerald said was the most important professional qualification he possessed. Ray reviewed the recordings and the documents and asked me a series of careful questions about the timeline. Then he told me something that made the air go out of the room. Dr. Harmon, the physician Nicole had referenced in the Day 7, recording the man who had allegedly agreed to sign a psychiatric competency assessment without conducting an examination, had had his medical license revoked by the Ohio State Medical Board in March of 2022. The revocation was a matter of public record filed on the board's official database, citing professional misconduct. Any document he signed, purporting to be a formal medical assessment, would be not only fraudulent, but immediately verifiable as such by any court in Ohio. They didn't do their research, Ray said. No, Gerald agreed. They got comfortable. That afternoon, while Ray began quietly building the formal case file, Gerald sat with me at the kitchen table, and we worked through the legal protections available to me under Ohio law. I revoked the preliminary equity loan application in writing citing identity fraud with Gerald's firm listed as my legal representative. I updated my existing will and established a revocable living trust, a legal instrument that placed my home and remaining assets into a trust structure with Gerald named as successor trustee, meaning that no court petition or power of attorney could unilaterally transfer control of those assets without triggering a formal legal challenge. I changed the passwords on every financial account I held and added Gerald as an authorized contact on each one. In Ohio, a person who has resided in a property for more than 30 days acquires certain tenant protections, even without a formal lease agreement. This meant that removing Marcus and Nicole from the house required either their voluntary departure or a formal eviction process through Montgomery County Court. Gerald prepared the notice in advance, a written demand to vacate the premises within 30 days, to be served after the Christmas confrontation when their actions had been formally documented in front of witnesses. Through all of it, I went home each evening and made dinner. I asked Marcus how his day had gone. I told Nicole the kitchen smelled wonderful when she reheated leftovers. I thanked her for managing the utility bill. I smiled at the right moments. I asked no questions that would make them uncomfortable. I gave them nothing that looked like suspicion, nothing that looked like preparation, nothing that looked like anything other than a 68-year-old woman moving quietly through her days in the house where she had lived for 31 years. Theodore used to say that the quietest person in the room is usually the one who already knows how the story ends. 2 days before Christmas, Nicole stood in the kitchen doorway and told me she had invited 30 people for a holiday dinner. Family, friends, neighbors, Marcus's business contacts. She said it with the confident ease of someone announcing plans for a house that belongs to them. "It'll be a real family Christmas," she said. "You deserve that, Mom." She smiled at me. I smiled back. "That sounds lovely," I said. "Let me know if you need anything." She did not notice that my hands resting on the kitchen counter behind me were perfectly, absolutely still. I woke at 4:53 in the morning on Christmas Eve and lay in the dark of the small downstairs room for a long time before I got up. The room had been a guest room when Theodore was alive, a spare space we used for visiting relatives at the holidays with a quilt his mother had made, and a nightstand I had painted white one summer when I had more ambition than furniture budget. I had not chosen to sleep here, but I had been here long enough that the room had started to take on the particular quality of a place where a person does their most honest thinking. And at 4:53 on the morning of December 24th, I lay in the dark and thought about everything that was going to happen in the next 24 hours. I was not afraid. I want to be clear about that because fear would have been reasonable. And I have always found it useful to be precise about the things I actually feel rather than the things I am expected to feel. What I was lying there in the dark was tired. Not the tired that comes from poor sleep, though that was also present. The tired that comes from 6 months of watching something you love be slowly dismantled by people you trusted and having to stand still and say nothing and smile at the right moments while the work continued around you. I got up at 5:15. I put on my robe and my slippers and walked upstairs to the kitchen and made coffee in the dark the way I had made it every morning for 31 years, in this kitchen measuring the grounds by feel, because I had done it so many times that my hands knew the quantity without being asked. I stood at the kitchen window with my mug and looked out at Theodore's rose garden. The bushes were bare the way they always were in December, thin dark lines against the gray pre-dawn, the soil around them hard with frost. Theodore had planted those roses the spring after Marcus moved out 12 bushes in 4 colors. He had spent an entire weekend digging the beds himself, refusing my offer to hire someone coming inside each evening with dirt under his fingernails and an expression of deep private satisfaction. "They'll be here long after we're gone," he had told me, washing his hands at this same kitchen sink. "Roses are stubborn that way." I pressed my hand flat against the cold glass of the window. Then I took my phone from the pocket of my robe and called Gerald. He answered on the second ring. Gerald Potts had been awake since 5, which did not surprise me because in 30 years of knowing him, I had never once seen evidence that he slept past 6 on a day when something important was happening. "We're ready," I said. "Ray confirmed last night," he said. "He and I will be at the end of the driveway by 6:30 tomorrow evening. 1 text and we come in." "1 word," I said. "I'll send 1 word." "What word?" I thought about it for a moment. I looked at Theodore's roses in the frost. "Now?" I said. Gerald said he would be there. He said it the way Theodore used to say things he meant absolutely, without elaboration, without reassurance, seeking just the plain fact of it offered and left to stand on its own weight. I stayed on the phone for another minute, without either of us speaking, which was its own kind of conversation, and then I thanked him and hung up. By 7 o'clock, I had pulled Theodore's recipe box from the back of the cabinet, where I had moved it after Nicole reorganized the kitchen, and I had the ingredients for his mother's pecan pie laid out on the counter. The real recipe handwritten on a 3x5 index card in faded blue ink, the one that called for dark corn syrup and a full stick of butter, and a tablespoon of bourbon that Theodore always said was the only honest ingredient in the whole thing. I had made this pie every Christmas for 40 years. I was not going to stop making it because a caterer was arriving at noon. Nicole came downstairs at 8:30 dressed already, her hair done, carrying her phone in one hand and a to-do list in the other. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the counter. The mixing bowl, the measuring cups, the pie crust I had already rolled and fitted into the dish. "Mom," she said with the patient firmness she had perfected over 6 months of living in this house. "I told you the caterers are handling everything. You don't need to do all this." "I know," I said. "This one's not for the party." She looked at me for a moment, weighing something, and then her phone buzzed and she looked down at it and walked back out of the kitchen without another word. I finished the pie. I put it in the oven and set the timer and stood at the sink washing the mixing bowl and listening to the sound of Nicole's heels on the hardwood above me as she moved through the house, managing her preparations, directing the caterers when they arrived, rearranging the dining room furniture to accommodate 30 guests. I washed the bowl. I dried it. I put it back in its cabinet. That evening, after the caterers had gone, and the house was quiet and Marcus and Nicole had retreated upstairs, I sat alone in the living room in the dark with the Christmas tree lights on the tree. I had decorated myself 2 weeks ago while Nicole was out with the ornaments Theodore and I had collected over 40 years of married Christmases. The ones the grandchildren had made with popsicle sticks and glitter. The small wooden cardinal Theodore had carved by hand the winter of 1988. I held the cardinal in both hands and looked at the lights for a long time. "I am not sure I am strong enough for tomorrow, Teddy," I said to the empty room. The house made no sound, but there was something in that silence that felt less like absence and more like the particular quality of attention a person pays when they are listening very carefully, and I felt it settle around me the way warmth settles gradually and then all at once. I put the cardinal back on its branch, turned off the tree lights, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in 6 months. Before I reveal what happened on that unforgettable Christmas dinner and how everything was exposed, type "now" in the comments below so I know you're still here with me. Also, please note the story ahead includes dramatized and fictional elements crafted for entertainment and reflection. If that's not for you, feel free to stop the video right here. I dressed carefully on the morning of Christmas Day. Not quickly, not carelessly, but with the deliberate attention I used to give to things that mattered, the way I had dressed for Theodore's company dinners, for Marcus's college graduation, for the morning of Theodore's funeral, when I had stood in front of the closet for a long time, understanding that whatever I chose to wear, I would remember for the rest of my life. I chose the navy dress. Theodore had bought it for me at a department store in Columbus 7 years ago on a Saturday afternoon when we had driven up for no particular reason and wandered in out of the cold, and he had pulled it from the rack and held it up and said, "This one, Evie. This is the one." He had been right the way he was. Right about most things that did not involve household repairs. I had worn it to his retirement dinner and to our 45th anniversary, and I had not worn it since the week before he died. I put on the pearl brooch next. He had given it to me on our 30th anniversary, a small cluster of freshwater pearls on a gold setting, simple enough to wear every day and fine enough that I never quite felt I deserved to. I fastened it at the collar of the navy dress and looked at myself in the mirror above the bathroom sink for a long moment. 68 years old, gray at the temples, lines at the corners of my eyes, hands that showed every decade of the work they had done. I thought I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who had built something real and was not going to let it be taken from her without a fight. I went upstairs and made coffee and ate a piece of the pecan pie for breakfast standing at the kitchen counter, and I thought that Theodore would have found that extremely reasonable. The guests began arriving at 5 o'clock. I stood in the living room and greeted each one as they came through the front door of my home neighbors I had known for 2 decades, a couple from the end of Clover Hill Road who had helped us shovel out after the blizzard of 2010, Marcus's former business partner and his wife people, whose names I knew and whose children's names I knew, and who had sat at this table before, when Theodore was alive, and the house smelled like his mother's pecan pie every Christmas, and nobody had to be hired to cook it. Nicole moved through the room with the ease of a hostess who had forgotten she was not the one who owned the house. She directed the caterers, arranged the seating, accepted compliments on the decorations with a smile that did not once acknowledge that every ornament on the tree and every piece of china on the table belonged to someone else. Marcus stood near the fireplace with a drink in his hand and worked the room the way he always had, easy conversation, quick laugh, the social confidence that had always come naturally to him and that I had once been proud of. I watched both of them. I smiled when smiled at. I answered questions about my garden, about how I was managing, about whether the holidays were difficult without Theodore. I said the things that were expected of me, and I said them warmly, and I did not once let my eyes show anything other than a 68-year-old woman enjoying a Christmas party in her home. At 6:15, the caterers began seating the guests for dinner. The dining room table had been extended to its full length for the first time since Theodore's last Christmas, draped in the white linen tablecloth we had received as a wedding gift 45 years ago, set with the china Theodore's mother had left us. 30 people found their places and settled into the particular comfortable noise of a large gathering, about to be fed chair legs, scraping napkins, shaken out the low, warm hum of 30 conversations layering over each other. I moved toward the head of the table, not because I was making a point, because it was where I always sat. It was where I had sat at every family dinner in this house for 31 years, the chair at the head of the table where I could look down the length of it and see Theodore at the other end, and between us, whatever version of family we had assembled that year. I had sat in that chair at Christmases and Thanksgivings and Easter Sundays and ordinary Tuesday dinners, and it had never once required a decision. It was simply where I went. Nicole's hand came down on the back of the chair before I reached it. She did not touch my arm. She did not lean in and speak quietly. She placed her hand on the back of my chair and turned to face me and spoke at a volume calibrated for an audience in the flat, unhurried tone of a person who has rehearsed what they are about to say and is not nervous about saying it. "Actually, Mom, why don't you find somewhere else to sit tonight?" The room did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in a wave conversation, dropping table by table as the register of Nicole's voice reached each cluster of guests and pulled their attention toward the head of the table. "This is our home now," Nicole continued, her hand still resting on the back of my chair. "You're a guest here. I think it's time you started acting like one." 30 people stared. Forks hovered. Marcus looked down at his plate with the focused intensity of a man examining a pattern in the china that had apparently become very interesting in the last 4 seconds. I felt every eye in that room land on me and wait. I looked at Nicole's hand on the back of my chair. I looked at Marcus, who did not look up. I looked at the white linen tablecloth that had been a wedding gift, the china that had belonged to Theodore's mother, the table that Theodore had refinished by hand in the summer of 2003, because the surface had started to show its age, and he said a table that had held that many family dinners deserved to be taken care of. I reached out and picked up the linen napkin from my place setting. I folded it slowly and precisely into a neat rectangle. I set it beside the water glass I had not yet touched. Then I looked at Nicole with an expression I had been saving for exactly this moment. Not anger, not hurt, not the trembling dignity of a woman who has been wounded. Something quieter and more final than any of those things. "Excuse me," I said. "I need a moment." I walked out of that dining room with my back straight and my steps even on the hardwood floor Theodore had laid with his own hands, and I did not look back at a single one of those 30 faces watching me go. In the hallway, I took my phone from the pocket of my navy dress. I typed one word and pressed send. Now. I stood in the hallway for 3 minutes and 14 seconds. I know the exact time because I watched the clock on my phone, the same way I used to watch the clock in the delivery room 41 years ago when the nurse told me to breathe and count and focus on something concrete while my body did the hardest work it had ever been asked to do. Breathing, counting, focusing on something concrete. Some things do not change. The front door opened without a knock. Gerald came in, first moving with the unhurried authority of a man who has entered difficult rooms before. Ray Kowalski followed. Behind Ray came 2 uniformed officers from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. Not young, not theatrical, just 2 people doing a job they had agreed was worth doing on Christmas night. I led them to the dining room. The silence that fell over 30 people happened in layers nearest the door. First, then outward a conversations breaking apart mid-sentence until the room went as still as a held breath. Nicole stood up so fast her chair scraped back across the hardwood like a short, sharp note on a piano. "What is this?" Her voice was still controlled but working harder than it had been 60 seconds ago. "Who are these people, Marcus?" Marcus had risen too, one hand gripping the table edge, his face gone the color of the white linen tablecloth. Gerald set his leather portfolio on the table and spoke in the voice he used in courtrooms, not loud, not performative, simply clear enough that every person in that room heard every word. "My name is Gerald Potts. I am Mrs. Evangeline Marsh's attorney of record. A fraudulent home equity loan application submitted in Mrs. Marsh's name, a forged power of attorney, and a falsified psychiatric competency assessment, signed by a physician whose Ohio medical license was revoked in March of 2022, have all been formally reported to the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, the Ohio Attorney General's Elder Abuse Unit, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. These officers are here as witnesses to a formal notice requiring Marcus Marsh and Nicole Marsh to vacate this property within 72 hours. Given the criminal conduct already documented and formally reported to law enforcement, the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office confirmed that an expedited notice period was applicable under Ohio law." Marcus's knuckles went white against the linen. "You don't have any proof," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. "It's your word against ours, Mom. That's all this is." I took my phone from the pocket of my navy dress. The audio file was already open. I set it on the table and pressed play. Marcus's own voice filled the room. "If she finds out before we file, the whole thing falls apart." Nicole's voice. "She won't. She trusts you. That's the whole point." Marcus again. Harmon confirmed he'll sign off. We give him the documentation and he files it as a formal assessment. Not one person at that table moved. A woman near the center pressed both hands over her mouth. Marcus's former business partner pushed back from his chair the involuntary movement of someone putting distance between themselves and something they did not want to be near. Nicole's face did not crumple. It simply closed the way a door closes when the latch catches swift and final. Marcus looked at the phone on the table, and for the first time in 6 months, I watched his face show something honest. He looked like a boy who had broken something that could not be fixed and had only now fully understood that. I looked at my son for a long moment. 41 years old, standing in the house his father had built. "Your father built this house for us, Marcus," I said, "not for you to sell it." He did not answer. He did not look up. By 8 o'clock, the dining room was empty. The 30 guests had retrieved their coats and filtered out in clusters, speaking low, not looking at each other. Nicole said something sharp to one of the officers and was answered in a tone that stopped her before she finished the sentence. I stood in my front hallway and watched the last car back out of the driveway. Then I closed the front door, turned the deadbolt, and stood in the quiet of the house Theodore built. I stayed in that house. Not because I won, because it was never about winning. Looking back on this family drama, the lesson is simple. I waited too long. I kept forgiving when I should have been watching. Don't be like me. Trust what you feel earlier. Act before they get comfortable. I believe God doesn't give us what we've built so that others can take it. He gives us the wisdom to protect it if we're willing to listen. Revenge stories with Mom are never really about revenge. They are about a woman who spent a lifetime being patient and finally understood that patience without boundaries is not a virtue. It is an invitation. My personal view: every family drama begins the same way, not with a betrayal, but with the first moment you stayed quiet when you should have spoken. Find your voice before it costs you everything. These revenge stories with Mom exist because real people, mothers, grandmothers, women who built everything from nothing deserve to be heard. If revenge stories with Mom and family drama like this one move, you leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for reflection and education. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you and take good care of yourself.